I have been craving for an album like this for quite some time. So the moment that I listened to it, I have not been able to stop at all, and that's part of the reason why this one took me so long to actually get an album review out. It's been out for a number of weeks now, and yeah, I just I know whenever I put out an album review, it kind of puts the album on the shelf so that I dive into other albums, and I didn't want to do that with this one. So now let's actually take the plunge and talk about this one. So let's dive in.
My one-winged companion abandons in gruesome mistrust, and I'm left alone with my teeth.
Thim by Azure. So Azure is how do I even quantify Azure? I would say that Azure is like a modern prog outfit in the same tangent that, say, a Thank You Scientist or Bentley or even a little bit of like the Deer Hunter, like I feel as if the vocal works are very similar to a Casey Crescenzo or the Thank You Scientists and that kind of a style, while having this kind of infusion of like a jazz fusion and modern prog sentimentalities. Like I do feel as if this is like the next big wave of progressive rock. It's this kind of jazzy, very avant-garde, very rock and opposition style that we got from bands like Thank You Scientists, The Deer Hunter, and even to a certain extent a little bit less like emo and metal, but definitely in that kind of same vein as like a Coheed and Cambria. And so this is the third album from Azure, and I found out about them with their previous album, their 2021 album, Of Brine and Angels' Beaks. And that was fine. It was fine. It kind of got me introduced to what they were putting down. It gave me a familiarity with what they were doing. And Wishing for Spirits was a fine record, their debut record. But I feel like here they have honed their skills. They've really, I wouldn't necessarily say they've completely perfected their craft, but they're definitely on the right track. Each album they've learned from whatever it was that they did in their previous record to then go forth and apply it to their next one. And I've just been absolutely loving this record. It is a double disc concept record, and take that for what it's worth. For some people, they might get very excited about it. It's almost an hour and 20 minutes long. It's practically a full-length feature film in that sense. But for a lot of other people, like, that's a pretty hard ask. Like sitting down and listening to an hour and 20 minutes worth of music that's a pretty big ask. So I think that's kind of my biggest criticism is I think Azure bit off more than they could chew on this particular record. It is a little bit overblown. It is a little bit overlong. I think the concept and the narrative story that they're trying to tell here starts to get lost in the weeds by a lack of editing, a lack of polishing, and this kind of trying to throw everything at the wall and seeing if it sticks. One of the biggest, I don't want to say failings of this record, but one of the things that I do take for is the length. A lot of these tracks probably could have either been eaten up by other tracks and making 2 or 3 tracks that are in the 10 or 20 minute mark, rather than having only 2 longer stretches of music being at 11 and 16 or 17 minutes. Now, that all being said, that is really the only drawback that I can have of this record. I love the story. The actual story, this very sci-fi meets fantasy. It's something that like Rush or Arion or I don't know, even like a Dream Theater Astonishing would try to tackle. But I feel like this does it very well. We have very astute characters. We have a lot of really fun aspects of there. And it really does run the gamut of the different styles that these boys are really putting down. It can be chaotic at times. It can be overblown at times. It can be overbearing at times. At the end of the day, it's just a pure prog beauty, and I absolutely love it for that kind of stuff. There are some moments that I feel as if people might get their backs up with and might get their cackles over. The Lavender Fox being kind of the prime example with these very strange and odd singing styles. But for me, I think it adds to the mythos that these boys are playing with. It adds this kind of playing style. And I'm like, okay, yeah, we're getting more into this world. We're getting more into the sentimentalities of what's going on here. And I particularly enjoy that. I also love that, and I wish that they carried it through with the rest of the album, these kind of phases within these tracks. Like the first track of the Azonist as well as Den of Dawn. It's one track that kind of has these different phases and parts in it, as well as the second longest song of Sailing Sky, Beyond the Bloom, and Wilt. And I really enjoy when a single track has these different phases and they don't just cut the track into different pieces. It allows the track to flow and to move from one phase to another phase to another. I wish that they kind of continued that on a little bit more, maybe combining like Angelic State with Doppelganger and the Protent. But much like big concept albums from, say, like last year, like No Spoon's Opus, you have these stories and you have these characters and you have these like single tracks that really kind of like point the finger at whatever's going on. Like Doppelganger, for an example, I love when they just kind of say, hey, now there's two of me kind of running around, and it's interesting. I think the only thing holding this album back for me to be like an instant classic, or one that I will continuously come back for, once again, is the runtime and the structure. I'm thinking too, I think the most easy one to go one-to-one with would be an album like Terraformer with Thank You Scientist, where you had practically the same amount of runtime, but because the tracks were longer and they had that signature moment in each of the tracks, it was a lot more digestible. There was something for me to come back to. The only thing for me to come back to on this is obviously the outstanding musicianship and playing style, as well as the narrative flow, but there isn't like that big signature moment every handful of minutes. At least with Terraformer, you had these averaging 10-minute tracks that I could always point to and be like, okay, there's that signature moment to hang on to grab onto, to either look forward to or to swirl and to rotate around. Because we're dealing with, 12 tracks that average around 4 to 6 minutes on average, with the 2 tracks that are a little bit longer, it's a little bit harder to grab onto. It's a little bit harder to immediately grab. Who knows how this album is going to age throughout the year? I've already got and put in a number of spins over the course of a number of weeks, so I'm really hoping to discover those signature moments across this album. But because so many of these tracks are in bite-sized chunks, I have a feeling that there will be a number of tracks that kind of get lost to the wayside because they're either between those signature moments or they just kind of meander and wander the landscape. That being said, this album is still probably the best Azure album that I've heard. They're on the course for writing probably one of my favorite records of all time. I don't think we found it here, but we're definitely on the course for it being in the future. I highly recommend this record, especially if you're a fan of bands like Thank You Scientist, like The Deer Hunter, and like Coheed and Cambria. If you like a little bit more of the jazz aspect in your modern progressive rock, I think you're really going to enjoy this one. And in the end, I will say, Fim by Azure is still one that I would absolutely pick up in physical format. I don't know if I would run out and get like the vinyl, but definitely the CD. This is the kind of prog that I would love in like the double disc, and having the CDs for that. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at for Fim. This would get like a light recommendation, and this would only get a recommendation if you are a fan of those albums that I mentioned before. I wouldn't necessarily go into this completely blind. This wouldn't be an album that I would recommend to start off with if you've never heard a Deer Hunter record or a Thank You Scientist record or even like a Bent Knee record. I think there needs to be a little bit of a priming of the pump before you dive into something like this. Or you can just take the plunge and see if you like it. Who am I to tell you what to do? That's what I've got for Fim from Azure. I want to know what you guys thought about this record. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. That's where I'm going to leave you. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.